Consider for a moment the safety match. A splinter of aspen wood, tipped with phosphorus, worth a fraction of a cent. It is ephemeral. It exists only to be consumed, to flare once and then turn to ash. It is the most mundane object in human history. Yet in the hands of a quiet Swedish engineer in the 1920s, this disposable splinter became the foundation of a financial empire that rivaled the treasuries of the great powers. He did not build his throne on gold, nor oil, nor steel. He built it on the promise of fire, and the far more dangerous promise of stability in a world shattered by war. But as we gaze upon the portrait of Ivar Kreuger, the man the world would come to know as the Match King, we do not see a robber baron with a clenched fist. We see a gentleman, a man of silence. A man who understood that in the high stakes of global finance, the loudest voice in the room is often the least powerful. He controlled 75% of the world's match production, lent hundreds of millions to sovereign states, and held the economic fate of Europe in his manicured hands. But the ledger tells a different story. It tells us that the greatest structures are often built on the most fragile ground. Now, let us open the archives and reveal the shadow behind the success. To understand the architecture of this colossus, we must step into the smoking ruins of post-World War I Europe. The continent was not merely damaged, it was insolvent. Germany was hyperinflating, France was drowning in debt, and Poland was struggling to define its own borders. The old monarchies were dead, and the new democracies were starving for capital. Enter Ivar Kreuger. He was not a banker in the traditional sense. He was a structural engineer by trade, a man trained to calculate loads and stresses. He applied this logic to the chaotic machinery of international finance with a terrifying precision. His proposition was elegant, almost seductive in its simplicity. He offered what no traditional bank dared to provide: massive, unsecured loans to desperate governments. In exchange, he demanded a sovereign monopoly, the exclusive right to manufacture and sell matches within that nation's borders for decades. He bought entire countries with American dollars, securing a stream of monopoly profits that he claimed would repay the loans with interest. It was a perfect circle of liquidity. American investors, drunk on the optimism of the Roaring Twenties, bought Kreuger's securities, believing they were investing in the reconstruction of civilization itself. Kreuger took their cash, loaned it to Europe, and pocketed the monopolies. In the painted portraits of the era, Kreuger appears as the ultimate technocrat. He operated out of a silent office in Stockholm in a room lined with silence, literally. He had the walls padded to dampen sound. He spoke in a whisper. He despised the chaotic shouting of the New York Stock Exchange. He presented himself as the antidote to the volatility of the age. Investors didn't just trust him, they revered him. He was the savior of Europe, the man who was knitting the fractured continent back together with loans and matchsticks. But the genius of Kreuger was not in the matches. It was in the psychology of the unit. He understood that people do not analyze what they trust. By keeping the underlying asset, the match, so cheap, so ubiquitous, and so boring, he ensured that no one looked too closely at the numbers. Who investigates the accounting of a 2-cent commodity? It flew beneath the radar of scrutiny. This was the golden silence. Kreuger insisted on absolute secrecy in his dealings, citing the sensitivity of negotiating with prime ministers and presidents. He refused to have his books audited, claiming that to reveal his trade secrets would be to arm his competitors. And the world, hungry for a hero and blinded by the consistent, high dividends he paid out like clockwork, agreed. They confused his secrecy for discretion. They mistook his arrogance for stewardship. Yet a closer examination of the early ledgers reveals the first cracks in the concrete. The monopolies were profitable, yes, but not profitable enough to service the massive interest payments he was promising his American investors. The math was already beginning to drift. To maintain the illusion of infinite growth, Kreuger needed constant motion. He needed more countries, more monopolies, more loans. He wasn't just building a business. He was constructing a machine that consumed capital to produce confidence. He was an engineer of expectations. And as the 1920s roared toward their inevitable climax, the Match King began to realize that the only way to keep the fire burning was to throw more of the furniture into the flames. In the anatomy of every great financial disaster, there is a moment where math ceases to be a tool of measurement and becomes a tool of obfuscation. For Ivar Kreuger, that moment arrived when the reality of his returns could no longer support the fantasy of his promises. A traditional businessman might have declared bankruptcy or restructured, but Kreuger was not a businessman. He was a sovereign state of one. He did not accept the laws of economics. He sought to rewrite them. And so, he began to build a labyrinth. The archives reveal the construction of a shadow empire, a parallel dimension of finance designed to absorb the toxic waste of his legitimate business. He established a constellation of subsidiary companies in jurisdictions with loose regulations: Liechtenstein, Switzerland, the Netherlands. The most notorious of these was a Dutch entity named Garanta. To the outside world, Garanta was a robust financial partner. In reality, it was a corporate ghost. It had no employees, no office, and no business. It existed solely as a trash bin for Kreuger's bad debts. Here, we see the mechanic at work. When Kreuger and Toll, his holding company, faced a loss, Kreuger would simply transfer that loss to Garanta. In exchange, Garanta would issue a promissory note, an IOU, back to the parent company. Kreuger would then list this IOU as a secured asset on his main balance sheet. He was essentially lending money to himself through a mirror and calling it profit. He created liquidity out of thin air, turning deficits into dividends through the alchemy of the ledger. It was the first modern instance of off-balance sheet financing, a technique that would be rediscovered by the architects of Enron 70 years later. But Kreuger operated on a scale that Enron could only dream of. He was shifting hundreds of millions of dollars between banks that he owned, creating a dizzying velocity of capital that blinded auditors. The money moved so fast that no one could tell it was the same dollar bill circling the globe. But a Ponzi scheme, no matter how sophisticated, is a biological entity. It must be eaten. As the 1920s waned, the hunger of the machine grew ravenous. The dividends had to be paid. The interest on the American loans had to be met. And the monopolies he had purchased in Poland, in Peru, in Greece were not generating enough cash. The friction of reality was wearing down the gears. This is where the psychological profile of the Match King shifts from the cold calculator to the desperate gambler. The sovereign monopolies became harder to secure. Governments were becoming wary. To keep the stock price high, Kreuger needed a coup. He needed the biggest prize of all, Italy. In the dimly lit private office in Stockholm, the engineer sat alone. He needed to show his American bankers that he had secured the Italian match monopoly from Benito Mussolini. But the negotiations had stalled. A rational man would have admitted defeat. Kreuger, however, simply opened his desk drawer. What follows is one of the most audacious acts of forgery in history. It was not a check he forged, nor a contract. It was sovereign debt. Kreuger personally drafted Italian government bonds worth nearly $142 million billions in today's currency. He famously sat at his desk, unsupervised, and traced the signatures of Italian officials onto the documents. He even forged Mussolini's signature. These were not digital lies. They were physical artifacts. He placed these forged bonds in his safe, the sanctum sanctorum, that no one was allowed to open. When bankers asked for proof of his assets, he would point to the safe, his face a mask of serene confidence, and whisper that the sensitive nature of the Italian deal required absolute discretion. The bonds were never traded. They simply sat there, a silent paper anchor, weighing down the entire global economy. They were the collateral for the loans that kept the lights on in Stockholm. The empire was now backed by nothing but ink and nerve. Then came October 1929, the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression was not merely a market correction. It was a sudden, violent withdrawal of the tide. Liquidity evaporated. The American investors, who had been throwing money at Kreuger, suddenly wanted it back. The safety match was no longer enough. The banks tightened the screws. Kreuger frantically tried to plug the holes in the hull. He merged companies, shifted assets, and wired money that didn't exist. He was playing three-dimensional chess against a market that was collapsing into chaos. The stress began to manifest physically. Those who saw him in these final months described a man who looked like a wax figure left too close to the fire. His silence, once seen as strength, now looked like catatonia. He developed a strange psychosomatic condition where he could not tolerate the touch of human skin. He began to wear gloves constantly, insulating himself from the world he was defrauding. The breaking point arrived in the form of a corporate merger. Desperate for cash, Kreuger attempted to merge his telecom interest, Ericsson, with the American giant, ITT. The deal was signed, the money transferred. But the Americans, unlike the Europeans, were not charmed by the golden silence. They sent auditors. The auditors asked the one question Kreuger could not answer. Where is the cash? They demanded to see the securities. They demanded to open the books of the subsidiaries. They demanded to open the safe. For the first time in his life, the engineer could not calculate a solution. The variables had become infinite. The lie had grown so large it had developed its own gravity, and it was beginning to crush him. He fled to New York, then back to Paris, a ghost ship drifting between ports, pursued by cables and telegrams demanding explanations. The facade of the stoic Scandinavian billionaire was crumbling. He was no longer the match king. He was a man standing on the tracks, watching the train he built barrel towards him. The complex derivatives, the intercompany loans, the forged bonds, the entire labyrinth was about to be illuminated by the harsh light of forensic accounting. Paris, March 12, 1932. The City of Lights was gray, wrapped in the chill of a deepening economic winter. Ivar Kreuger sat in his apartment at 5 Avenue Victor Emmanuel III. The walls were high, the furniture elegant, a final stage set for a man who had lived his entire life as a performance. The scheduled meeting with his bankers was set for 11 a.m. They were waiting in the hotel lobby, armed with questions that had no answers. The Italian bonds were about to be exposed as worthless paper. The deficit in his books was not a gap, it was a canyon, roughly equal to the national debt of Sweden. There were no more subsidiaries to create, no more signatures to forge, no more time to borrow. The engineer had run out of runway. He did not scream. He did not flee. He simply walked to his bedroom, lay down on the bed fully clothed in a dark suit, and shot himself through the heart. The bullet did not just kill a man, it punctured the lung of the global economy. When the news hit the wires, the Match King is dead, the markets did not just dip, they convulsed. Kreuger securities were the most widely held stocks in the world. They were in the portfolios of widows, pension funds, and major banks. The value of his empire, once estimated at hundreds of millions, evaporated instantly. It was the financial equivalent of a nuclear detonation. The autopsy of the empire, conducted by the bewildered accountants of Price Waterhouse, revealed a corpse so riddled with fraud it seemed impossible it had ever walked. The Garanta account was empty. The Italian bonds were crude forgeries. The dividends paid out over the last decade had not come from profits, but from the capital of new investors, the definition of a Ponzi scheme. But unlike Charles Ponzi, who operated in a Boston backroom, Kreuger had institutionalized the fraud. He had woven it into the fabric of international relations. The cost was staggering. The suicide of Ivar Kreuger triggered the collapse of the Swedish Prime Minister's government. It led to suicides of bankers in New York and Stockholm. It wiped out the life savings of thousands. But the legacy of the Match King was not just ruin, it was regulation. The sheer scale of Kreuger's deception forced the United States to rewrite the rules of the game. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, the bedrock of modern financial transparency, were drafted largely in response to the wreckage he left behind. The requirement for independent audits, that exists because of Kreuger. The demand for standardized accounting practices, that exists because of Kreuger. He is the ghost in the machine of every compliance department on Wall Street. We often mistake luck for genius and silence for wisdom. Kreuger understood this flaw in our nature better than anyone. He knew that if you make the lie big enough, and if you wrap it in the respectable clothing of complexity and boredom, the world will not just believe you, they will thank you for it. He built a monument to stability using the bricks of chaos. He sold safety matches to a world he was dousing in gasoline. And in the end, he proved the oldest rule of the ledger: you cannot borrow against the truth forever. Now, the silence returns to the archives. The Match King lies in a grave in Stockholm, but his shadow stretches across every trading floor in the world. He taught us that the most dangerous lies are not the ones we are told, but the ones we are desperate to believe. He showed us that even the most solid empire can be nothing more than smoke waiting for a breeze. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.